Hey everyone, and welcome to Chef AJ Live. I'm your host, Chef AJ, and this is where I introduce you to amazing people like you who are doing great things in the world that I think you should know about. I am so excited for today's guest because I have wanted to meet him for over 10 years when I first saw his amazing YouTube video called Sugar, the Bitter Truth, which now has over 14 million views. I didn't really know how to get in touch with him, but as luck would have it, it turned out we had 3 mutual friends, and one of them was kind enough to introduce us. But I think even more important than our mutual friends is our mutual enemy, the processed food industry. It's such an honor to meet you. Please welcome Dr. Robert Lustig to the show. Thank you for taking the time to talk to my audience. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Chef AJ. First of all, I want to say, all you had to do is, just get in touch with me. You didn't need a mutual introduction. How could I possibly turn down somebody whose email address is at eatunprocessedfood.com?
Well, I don't know if you know, but my very first book was called Unprocessed. It's being republished, the 10th anniversary edition. And if I didn't have an interview right before this, I wanted to wear this shirt just for you. But I didn't have time to change. Yeah, you are so passionate about this. You're such a passionate anti-sugar advocate. Why did that? I mean, I know probably because of your work as a pediatric endocrinologist, but you are really one of the best voices about this.
Well, so, people ask me all the time, like, how'd you get into this? And the answer is through the back door. I didn't come with an agenda. This was not my fight. I took care of short kids, but then the short kids got fat on me. And, I was left to try to pick up the pieces in terms of what was going on. And of course, everyone was saying, well, these kids are just, gluttons and sloths. They're perpetrators. They eat too much, exercise too little. And I was a fat kid myself, and I sort of know how that lands, and wasn't very happy about it. So there was that. But then I started doing the science, and it was really the science that brung me. I started out my career at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital, the pediatric cancer hospital in Memphis, Tennessee. And they had a whole cadre, a whole stable of children who'd survived their brain tumor only to become massively obese. Now, before the tumor, they were perfectly fine in terms of weight for height. And then, because of the damage from either the tumor or the surgery or the radiation, they became massively obese. This form of obesity is called hypothalamic obesity because of hypothalamic damage. The hypothalamus is the area of the brain where energy balance is controlled and regulated. In fact, I just gave a talk on this to the British Society of Pediatric Endocrinology this morning. These kids are not perpetrators. They are victims. And we have the biochemistry to explain how this occurs. And we also can treat it with medicines that treat the problem. So I knew that at least this group of patients had an organic, bona fide biochemical reason for their obesity. Then we started investigating other kids and also adults. And it turned out that a sizable proportion of them had the exact same problem. They just didn't have a brain tumor. So I knew very early on that there was, real science and real biochemistry that had to be brought to bear on this question. And then in 2006, I realized that the answer was sugar. And so I started talking about that. And that landed well with the scientific community. And then I gave that 2009 YouTube video for the general public. And then after that, I started learning about the dark underbelly of the food industry and realizing that it wasn't by accident that our entire processed food system had basically blown up, both figuratively and literally, in terms of the obesity and in terms of the sugar content of our diet. And that's when I started to speak out. It was probably, 2012 when we published our Nature review article called The Toxic Truth About Sugar. And actually, since that time, it's only become more and more apparent that we were absolutely right. We said it then and we meant it. And now we know that sugar, specifically the fructose molecule, the sweet molecule in sugar, is 3 mitochondrial toxins in one. It inhibits 3 separate enzymes that are necessary to liberate energy. So that is not a food. When you inhibit your mitochondria, that's a poison. That's what cyanide does. So, in fact, I came to this as a reluctant warrior, as a non-advocate, as a scientist, but ultimately I realized that the science has to be translated into policy, but the politics get in the way. And so who better to be able to lead the charge than someone who can understand the science and battle back the industry?
Well, I thank you for your work. I'm not a fan of the processed food industry by any stretch. And I love how you say, if it has a label, it's a warning label.
Indeed. The fact is that real food doesn't have a label, doesn't need a label. The FDA rules say that you only need a label if something's been done to the food. So a radish doesn't have a label, a broccoli doesn't have a label, all right? If something's been done. So an apple does not have a label, but you know what? Apple slices in a package do have a label because something's been done. Now, it may be something very minor like cutting it up and destemming and deseeding it, but at least, something's been done. So therefore there needs to be a label. The point is that it's the degree of processing that determines whether or not a food is still good for you or whether or not it's actually been turned into poison. And that is not listed on the label. What's on the label is what's in the food. What we need to know is what's been done to the food, because all food is inherently good. It's what we do to the food that's not. And people have to learn that. And that's one of the reasons I wrote this latest book, Metabolical.
Yeah. By the way, the great title. Did you think of that yourself? It's a wonderful title.
So I have to tell you, my social media director thought of it. So, give credit where credit is due. I always do. My social media director had thought of it many years ago, and we decided to appropriate it for this book.
Well, I think it's perfect because I do think that the processed food industry is diabolical. And I think they, like the tobacco industry, I don't think it was an accident that they created an addictive product.
Indeed. Indeed. Today, just today, we learned that big oil is being brought to task finally in Congress for the fact that they knew what they were doing to climate change and did nothing about it. In 1994, big tobacco was brought to Congress for what they were doing, regarding lung cancer and doing nothing, and addiction, and doing nothing about it. All right. Opioids, they're having their day now as well. Ultimately, there are a whole bunch of industries that basically have adopted the same playbook, the deny and deflect playbook. And the food industry, unfortunately, has done the same. And so they need to be called out for their role in this obesity, diabetes, chronic disease pandemic.
Right. Well, people like you and Michael Moss and Dr. David Kessler, can you guys just beat them up or something? I mean, are they going to have their day in court, so to speak?
I don't know. It's going to be complicated. Ultimately, no one needs opioids. No one needs cigarettes. I suppose now that there are electric cars, no one needs petroleum, but we do need food. The question is ultra-processed food food?
I don't think so. That's why I think we should have to call it something else.
Well, so you have to understand the definition of food. So, Chef AJ, you're a chef. Mm-hmm. What is the definition of food?
I think it's something that's whole, that's found in nature, not that's processed in a manufacturing plant.
That's not what's in the dictionary.
Oh, I don't know then. What does the dictionary say?
The dictionary says substrate that contributes to the growth or burning of an organism. Now, that's a perfectly fine definition, and I can adhere to that definition. That's a fine definition. Substrate that contributes to either growth or burning of an organism. All right, so let's take that. Let's do burning first. Turns out sugar, because it is 3 mitochondrial toxins in one, actually inhibit burning. It doesn't contribute to burning, it actually inhibits burning, just like cyanide does. All right. And it turns out that if you give people the same number of calories, protein, carbohydrate, etc., in a processed versus unprocessed form, the unprocessed form causes you to lose weight, and the processed form causes you to gain weight on the same number of calories. So clearly, it's inhibiting burning, not just in a test tube, but in people. So now let's take the other side, growth. My colleague, Dr. Efrat Mansanigo-Ornan, who is the chairman of nutrition at Hebrew University, Jerusalem, just published a paper in Bone Research showing that ultra-processed food actually causes the washout of bone and the inhibition and stunting of bone growth, skeletal growth. And other colleagues have shown that, in fact, ultra-processed food contributes to cancer proliferation. So it's basically hijacking the growth paradigm. So in fact, ultra-processed food does not contribute to the burning of an organism. It does not contribute to the growth of an organism. It actually inhibits both of those. Therefore, ipso facto, ultra-processed food is not food. It is, in fact, poison. And we need to treat it as such, both in terms of public awareness and also in terms of legal.
Well, I agree with you. I haven't eaten sugar since Sunday, July 6, 2003, and I haven't eaten any processed food since January 2nd, 2012. So I agree with you. Yeah. So, but it's, processed food is readily available, socially acceptable, easily affordable.
Yep.
How do you, I read that Americans eat something like 67 to 72% of their calories from ultra processed food.
That's right.
I mean, I think it's an addiction.
Well, in fact, sugar is addictive. If you look at the various components within ultra processed food, the only two that are actually addictive are sugar and caffeine. So people say fat's addictive. No, it's not. People say salt is addictive. No, it's not. Okay. Sugar and caffeine are addictive. That's why sodas are so egregious, because they're both. All right. But in fact, when you actually look at the data, when you look at the neuroimaging, when you look at the economics, it's sugar and caffeine. All right. Those are addictive. Now, just because something's addictive doesn't make it poison, like caffeine. All right. Nobody's railing about Starbucks. Maybe they should, but they're not. It's the Frappuccino, but not the black coffee that's the problem. All right. The point is that sugar is both toxic and addictive. And so when you're toxic and addictive and ubiquitous and have a negative impact on society, those are the 4 criteria for regulation. And so we regulate cocaine, we regulate heroin, we regulate nicotine, we regulate alcohol, because they are both toxic and addictive and ubiquitous and have a negative impact on society. Well, sugar does too. And sugar is the hallmark. It's the benchmark for processed food. So ultimately, ultra-processed food is not food. It is poison. It is both toxic and addictive and ubiquitous, like you said. So the question is, how do you fix that? To me, the quickest answer, the shortest answer, the best answer is don't make it so cheap. And what makes it so cheap? Food subsidies. Because what do we subsidize? We subsidize corn, wheat, soy, sugar. The 4 things that are killing us.
Yeah.
So why are there food subsidies in the first place? And the answer goes back to 1933 with the original Farm Bill, because we had the Depression and the Dust Bowl at the same time. And we had all the food in the Northeast, and we needed to deliver to the Southwest. And so it had to be processed, or it would go rancid on the railroad cars by the time it got to the Southwest. So you put it in 10-pound, you put the flour in 10-pound bags, ship it on, railroad car, and bake it up on site, and you can feed an entire population. And we did. And that actually made sense all the way through World War II. But then it stopped making sense. But the food industry figured out how to make money at this. And so they doubled down. And so now, the food subsidy is their golden goose. That's what makes processed food cheaper, and it's what drives their profits because processed food is also addictive.
Right.
So until we fix the food subsidy problem, we're not going to fix the ubiquity or the addictive nature problem. So I think that's where you have to start. The problem is you need Washington for that, and they don't get it yet. So what could you do in the meantime while you're waiting for that? Well, that's what soda taxes are about. Okay, and we have soda taxes in San Francisco and Oakland and Albany and Philadelphia, and it works. And Berkeley, works. We have data that shows it works and it's durable. But, we got a whole bunch of libertarians, screaming, keep your hands off my soda, so that becomes a political imbroglio as well. So ultimately, we're going to have to solve this by educating the public as to what the problem is so that they will accept, whatever societal intervention makes the most sense for their culture.
Just want to read a nice comment by a live viewer, Dr. Daryl Woodruff, who says, your video, The Bitter Truth, changed the way I look at simple sugars.
That's very kind. That's nice.
Well, there were so many great things in your book. I didn't read it. I listened to it. And so I took some notes on my phone, but you said something that's really profound. There's no medicine we have that can undo the damage of processed food. That's right.
That is exactly right. So in the book, I bring up a concept, a paradigm that, people need to understand. All right. It's toxin A plus antidote B still equals death. All right. So let's say you have bacterial meningitis. All right. That's bad. You're going to die unless you get the right medicine, unless you get the right antibiotic with the right sensitivity, right? What if the doctor makes a mistake and gives you the wrong antibiotic?
Well,
you're still going to die.
Yeah.
All right. What if they give you an antiviral? You're still going to die, right? Because the antidote was not specific for the pathology. So ultra-processed food has the two things that are the worst for us. They have the addition of sugar and the removal of fiber. There is no medicine that can make the mitochondria work better because the sugar's hurting them. And there's no medicine that can make the microbiome better because the lack of fiber is hurting them. So you can put vitamin C in, you can put, whatever dietary supplement of the day you want to put in, biotin or, this, that, or the other thing. Ultimately, until you fix the inherent problem, you're not going to get any mileage out of it. And so that's what we see from the ultra-processed food industry is, vitamin water. That's not the answer to the problem. That's toxin A plus antidote B still equals death.
I host a summit called the GI Health Summit, and it's interesting how all the GI doctors talk about how deleterious ultra-processed food is just to our guts, to our microbiome.
Indeed.
Yeah.
That's right. And so how are you going to fix that? So people say, well, let's take a probiotic. So here's the question about probiotics, okay? A probiotic is a live culture. Right? It's a live bacterium. If it's a live bacterium, it should proliferate in your intestine. So you should only have to take it once. How come you have to take it every day? And do you know of any disease where you take a probiotic and it mitigates the disease? They say, but in fact, there are no data. There's not one study anywhere that shows that you can actually mitigate a disease with a probiotic, even if you do take it every day. This is the biggest scam on the face of the earth. Right now, I'm not saying the microbiome is not in trouble. It is. It's in big trouble. But if you think taking a probiotic is going to fix that trouble, I got a bridge to sell you. The reason that you need to take the probiotic is because that species is not in your gut right now. The point is, the reason that species is not in your gut right now is because it died because the environment it found itself in was not conducive to its survival. Well, that environment is the food you eat. So the food you eat is not conducive to that bacterium's survival. So what makes you think that taking another pill of it is going to make it any more conducive? How dumb is that? What you have to do is you have to change the environment that the bacteria find themselves in. And that's not a probiotic. That's a prebiotic.
Like fiber, maybe?
Like fiber. Fiber is the prebiotic. That's what bacteria live on. That's their food. That's their sustenance. They take the cellulose, they take the soluble fiber, and they turn it into short-chain fatty acids, which are good for you, while they eat and then proliferate. And so you increase your microbial diversity. You fix your microbiome in 2 days, when you add fiber to your diet without doing anything else. But unfortunately, our fiber consumption right now is less than half of what it should be. It is at 12 grams per day, and the FDA says it should be 25 grams per day, and really it should be 50 grams per day.
Right. You had so many good sayings or quotes or lines in the book, and I wrote down the ones I especially love. Like when you were talking about processed food, you called it a plate of slow consumable addictive poison, looks and tastes like food, altered and adulterated, not because they want your life, just your money. Food is a slow poison and leads to addiction.
Well, processed food is.
Processed food, right.
Processed
Right.
food.
Yes, of course. Yes.
Right. Slow poison that leads to addiction, toxic and addictive. All right. And when something's toxic and addictive, we regulate it. Except for food, nothing on the horizon, except for like soda taxes. And, you know, in there, we've got other problems like preemption and stuff. We can talk about the, you know, legal mumbo jumbo if you like. But ultimately, we need some sort of societal intervention because Medicare will be broke by the year 2029 and Social Security will be broke by the year 2034. In order for these programs to work, okay, the young, healthy people have to pay in so that the old, infirm people can take out. But what if the young, healthy people aren't healthy? What if they're not paying in? What if they're taking out because they're sick? The whole pyramid collapses, right? And that's what's going to happen by the year 2029, unless we fix this. You cannot fix healthcare until you fix health. You cannot fix health until you fix diet, and you cannot fix diet until you know what the hell is wrong. And we've been barking up the wrong tree for the last 50 years.
You should write a book just of saying you cannot fix healthcare until you fix health. And this is so unfortunate because the years that everything collapses is just when I'm eligible.
Oh, me too. Me too. So I'm very, very concerned. You know, I paid in and I'm not going to be able to take out. Maybe that's why I'm so, passionate about this. You know, I mean, I worked hard, you know, all those years taking care of, you know, all these obese kids for 40 years, you know, and then it won't even be Medicare for me when it's time for me to be able to use it.
Childhood obesity, that has to be very heartbreaking because I was the fat kid, but I was born in 1960 when there weren't any other fat kids. But now it's pretty common, isn't it, for children to be obese?
Absolutely. And that keeps going up. So we are seeing some reduction in toddler obesity, and that's good. And that, I mean, in no way is that bad. That's good. One of the reasons is because they've gotten juice out of the nursery schools. All right. People think juice is healthy. It's not. All right. The citrus growers of America have done a very good, you know, shall we say, propaganda job on us, making us think that juice is healthy. It is not. All right. Fruit is healthy because fruit has fiber. Juice is unhealthy because juice doesn't have fiber. All right. And so the sugar there's nothing to inhibit its absorption. That's what the fiber does. It inhibits the absorption of the sugar so it doesn't end up overwhelming your liver. Right. And because your liver, when it sees all this excess sugar, has no choice but to turn that sugar into fat. This is a process called de novo lipogenesis, new fat making. Right? It's how your liver processes excess carbohydrate to turn it into fat in order for storage. The problem is some of it precipitates in the liver. Now you got fatty liver disease. And once you have fatty liver disease, your pancreas has to make extra insulin to make the liver do its job. That raises insulin levels all over the body. And then that insulin is pressing on all your fat tissue to increase the amount of energy going into them. And it's also causing vascular smooth muscle proliferation in all your organs, causing your chronic renal failure and your heart disease and your Alzheimer's.
Is sugar the only problem, or is it all refined carbohydrates, including flour and alcohol?
Right. That's a very good question. So insulin is the bad guy. All right. Insulin lowers your blood glucose. Diabetics have to take shots of insulin. I don't argue that. But ultimately, insulin is both good and bad at the same time. It's good because it lowers your blood sugar. It's bad because of where it puts that sugar. It puts it in your fat, and it puts it in other organs for storage. And that's what the problem is. So insulin is short-term gain for long-term pain. That's the way you have to think about it. So the goal is to get the insulin down. Now, there are two things that make insulin go up. One is sugar. And sugar does it because it floods the liver with fat, thereby making the pancreas have to make more. That's called insulin resistance. And refined carbohydrate. Refined carbohydrate is glucose, starch. That makes the pancreas have to release insulin rapidly. That's called insulin secretion. So there's insulin resistance, there's insulin secretion. They're both a problem. So sugar's a problem because of insulin resistance. Refined carbohydrate's a problem because of insulin secretion. But between those two, insulin resistance is 7 times worse. So they're both problems. And real food doesn't have refined carbohydrate. Real food doesn't have much sugar, except unless it's with fiber like fruit. So real food works because it keeps the insulin down. Processed food makes the insulin go haywire.
How do you handle people maybe being upset with you because of your message? Because even though I'm vegan, and I've been vegan for 44 years for ethical reasons, I'm not very popular because I don't advocate eating any junk food, whether it's vegan or not. And people think it's crazy, restrictive, extreme, unrealistic.
Well, so first of all, let me address the vegan question. Okay, I'm not for vegan. I'm not against vegan. Vegan's a choice. Okay, you made the choice for religious reasons. Fine. I have no problem with that. Okay, there are lots of reasons to be vegan, but metabolic health is not one of them. Okay, you can be just as healthy being a carnivore as being a vegan. And don't forget that Coke, Doritos, and Oreos are vegan. All right, there's plenty of ways to screw up a vegan diet. In the same way, there are plenty of ways to screw up a keto diet. So just because you're on one or the other doesn't make you, the purveyor of all wisdom. That's, just not the case. There are a lot of ways to skin this cat. Okay, I respect your being vegan. You are welcome to be vegan. I'm happy you are vegan. Okay, just don't make other people vegan and shame them into it.
Except we can say skin a cat if we're vegan. Just making a joke there.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Okay. The point is that metabolic health is a different story. And that's what that's what both groups are lording over the other. The fact of the matter is real food works. And real food can be animal products. Real food can be plant products. Real food can be a combination of the two together. And real food works. It's processed food that doesn't. So whether it's processed food keto or processed food vegan, I don't care. It's processed. Okay, real food works. So, and we have the data to demonstrate that. So in the book, I do not take sides. I actually think that the vegans and the ketos have more in common than they have separating them. And the real enemy is the processed food industry. And actually the vegans and the ketos ought to get together and battle the common enemy rather than each other.
Yes, amen. That is why I have people like you and Michael Moss and Dr. Vera Tarman and Dr. Joan Iflin and Dr. Nicole Avina interview you guys as much as I can, because that is my message.
Indeed. So that is what we should be doing. The problem is the food industry wins when when these two dietary factions fight amongst themselves. Now, when people say, oh, it's too restrictive, since when is real food restrictive? Real food is very liberal, in fact. All right, there are, unfortunately, processed food is 74% of all the things in the grocery store. But if you cleared those things out and had more of the real food, okay, you wouldn't think it was very restrictive. You'd think you'd actually died and gone to heaven. The point is that most of what's in the supermarket is not real food. It's processed.
Right.
Basically, if it's on a shelf, it's processed because that's the only way it could stay on a shelf.
Absolutely.
Real food goes rancid because real food doesn't have preservatives in it. Real food doesn't have trans fats. Real food doesn't have emulsifiers. Real food is just real food. And so each of these, takes their toll metabolically. Trans fats are the devil incarnate. They basically shut down your mitochondria. Emulsifiers actually strip the mucus layer off your intestinal epithelial cells, predisposing you to leaky gut and inflammatory bowel disease. So, the bottom line is there's nothing in processed food that works. Real food does.
Right. I agree. Unite against the common enemy. You said that education never solved any addiction problem. Processed food is a hedonic substance. A lot of people don't believe in food addiction or sugar addiction. It's incredible. I mean, people that I know well that are doctors are like, it's not possible.
Well, it is possible. And, I will tell you, it is still controversial. I'm not arguing that. I am right now in the midst of writing my chapter for the new textbook of Food and Addiction by Kelly Brownell and Mark Gold. We have the data. We know the data. Despite that, there's an entire scientific faction that believes in eating addiction, not food addiction. They're all in Europe. The Americans believe in food addiction. The Europeans believe in eating addiction. And the question is, why is this? What's the difference? It matters. I mean, it's not just semantic, because if it's food addiction, then the industry has to do something to make things better. Whereas if it's eating addiction, then the onus is on the individual rather than the industry. So it's not just semantic, it matters. Ultimately, the definition of addiction can be met either in terms of the criteria set out by the American Psychological Association, and there are, it's tolerance and withdrawal or tolerance and dependence. And processed food meets the criteria for tolerance and dependence. And then there's neuroimaging. And we have the data for that as well, showing the change in dopamine D2 receptors in the nucleus accumbens, the reward center of the brain. So those are the two ways to document addiction, and we have both of them. So when people say, oh, not possible, you need sugar to live. That's the common response. How could you be addicted to something you need to survive? Well, you don't need sugar to survive. The Inuit had whale blubber. They never saw carbohydrate. Okay, they didn't have cancer. They didn't have heart disease. They were the healthiest people on the planet. The Rendille, the Tokelau, the indigenous tribes, the Maasai, they drink meat and drink milk and blood. They don't have any carbohydrate in their diet. Okay, and they're healthy as all hell. Famously, Vilhjalmur Stephenson, the famous Arctic explorer who didn't go to the North Pole first, he went to the North Pole most, who was stranded in Canada after a shipwreck because of an ice storm, lived amongst the Inuit for 2 years on nothing but whale blubber, realized that there was nobody sick in the entire village. No one died. And he came back to America, ended up checking him and his associate, his partner, into Bellevue Hospital for a year. And they ate nothing but meat for 1 whole year. And they published the paper in 1928 in Journal of Clinical Investigation, showing that these two men were healthier than everybody else working there, all right, because eating only meat. So the concept that, processed food is addictive is based on empiric data and imaging data, and and we have the data. It's not like it's made up. So that's why we're dead set on trying to get food addiction into the WHO ICD-11 criteria so that it can start being used as an appropriate diagnosis. So we're working on that.
Yeah, I cannot wait. I cannot wait. Live viewer Deepak says, Dr. Robert Lustig, I've been reading your books and watching your YouTube lectures. I have learned a lot about sugar and processed foods, and I have changed my eating habits. So that's
Excellent.
Wonderful. You saw really young children with fatty liver disease. And was that a consequence of these ultra-processed foods?
Well, so there are a lot of different reasons for fatty liver disease, but that is certainly one of them. I mean, there are lots of other reasons too. Ultimately, fatty liver occurs when your mitochondria don't work well. The famous mitochondrial toxin of all of pediatrics is aspirin, causing Reye's syndrome. And we learned this back in the 1980s. I was a resident when we learned this, and I had to take care of all these cases of Reye's syndrome. And basically, these kids' livers turned to fat, practically while you were watching them, right? Because aspirin is a mitochondrial toxin. Well, anything that causes the mitochondria to be poisoned, to not work well, can generate fatty liver. And there are many things that can do it. Alcohol, of course, does it. That's famous. All right. But kids don't drink alcohol. So for the most part, we hope not. We hope not. For the most part, the reason for pediatric fatty liver disease is sugar.
Do you think that sugar affects children's brains and their behavior?
So the answer is yes. We have data to support that. It is less solid than the metabolic data, but we have the behavioral data to support that. Whether or not it's having a direct effect on the mitochondria in the brain is still a matter of conjecture. We are proposing studies to actually measure P31 kinetics in the brain in terms of ATP generation to try to answer that question. That remains to be seen. That's not a done deal yet. We absolutely have the empiric data to show that. The question is it the sugar or is it the glucose crash that occurs afterward? And that's yet to be determined. So it definitely alters kids' cognition and capabilities. And chronically, we know that it causes reduction in hippocampal volume and also increased cerebrospinal fluid because there's been white matter loss in adolescents with metabolic syndrome. This is the work of Antonio Convit at NYU.
Right. Do you think if sugar was discovered today, it would be a controlled substance?
If sugar was discovered today, it would never even be allowed. It would have been banned because it meets all the criteria for banning it. But it was discovered in 1200 BC. It made it in under the wire. It got grandfathered in, as it were.
But back in the day, I mean, I remember reading the first book was Sugar Blues. People weren't using the egregious amounts that they are today. It was a condiment, like we would put curry on something. Exactly.
So the last time the FDA undertook an evaluation of the toxicity of sugar was in Nutrition Journal 1986, based on data collected up to 1980, which really was before the advent of high fructose corn syrup. And at that time, the median consumption in America was 51 grams per person per day. 51 grams. Now, 51 grams is more than it should be because the American Heart Association says 25 for women, 37.5 for men. So it was still high, but 51 grams is not that much higher than 37.5. Today, our consumption is 94 grams. So back in 1986, we were looking at a different consumption level than we are today. So I think we need to redo that analysis, that evaluation, and we are trying to put pressure on the FDA to revisit this question and look at the data on sugar and chronic disease today at this dose. Remember, the dose determines the poison, famously said by Paracelsus 1537. All right. So, there are poisons that are parts per billion keel over and die, like cyanide or VX gas or ricin or sarin. Okay. There are poisons that kill you in parts per million and take longer to do it, like arsenic or carbon tetrachloride or benzene. Okay. And then there are poisons that it takes a whole lot more to do, like tobacco smoke or sugar. Okay. And it takes a lot more exposure and a lot longer, but ultimately still kills you. Okay. Point is, all of those are poisons. Some are ultra acute, some are more acute, some are a little more chronic, some are, take almost a lifetime, but they're all still poisons and they need to be treated as such.
Great, thank you. You talk about in the book and in all the interviews I've listened to about protect the liver, feed the gut. How does one even know if they have excess fat in their liver?
Right. And your doctor doesn't know either. That's the problem. So this is like hypertension. You don't know you have a problem until you've, stroked out, unless somebody checks your blood pressure. So 90% of fatty liver disease is silent. You don't know you have it. But that fatty liver is causing metabolic dysfunction. It's causing hyperinsulinemia. It's causing chronic disease. And ultimately, something bad is going to happen to you because of it. So how do you know? How do you find out? Okay. The cheap way, the easy way, the free way is you measure your waist circumference. Greater than 40 inches for men, greater than 35 inches for women. There's a good chance you have liver fat. All right. It's sensitive, not specific. The next best way is a lab test. And it's a standard lab test you get, yearly, your doctor orders a chem panel. Right? And it's a test called an ALT, alanine aminotransferase. Now, the problem with this test is not the test. The test is fine. The problem is it's an interpretation. When I went to medical school in 1976, the upper limit of normal for ALT was 25. Today, the upper limit for ALT is 40. Same test. Used to be 25, now it's 40. How come? Answer, because everyone has fatty liver disease. And of course, the clinical lab doesn't know that. They just, take a whole bunch, thousands of, specimens, and they do the mean and the standard deviation around it. And 2 standard deviations on either side, that's where they put the range. And because the entire curve has shifted to the right, now that 2 standard deviations has gone from 25 up to 40. So your doctor looks at the lab slip and says, well, your ALT is fine because it's 35. That's not fine. That's not fine at all. But it's within the range that the lab slip says, because your doctor doesn't know that that's what's going on. And that's why I wrote the book, is to answer that question, is to basically give people the knowledge to be able to interpret their own lab tests and go to their doctor and say, hey, explain this to me. So that's the second best way, is with ALT. There are other ways. They get more expensive, like, for instance, liver ultrasound or MRI or pancreatic and liver elastography. All right, these are all imaging techniques that cost hundreds and hundreds of dollars. Okay, ultimately, start with an ALT.
ALT, that's a avocado, lettuce, and tomato sandwich. Just kidding. You said your doctor doesn't know what's going on. Could it be because, as you said in your book, Big Pharma is in charge of the curriculum of medical schools?
Well, that's a concern. I'm not going to tell you I know that that's why they don't know what an ALT is, but in general, most doctors, it's the 2 P's. It's the prescription pad and the procedures. That's what they know. They've basically, like I explain in the book, most doctors are taught medicine like it's a big game of Clue. Colonel Mustard in the conservatory with the candlestick. figure out the symptoms, determine the disease, make the diagnosis, and then assign the treatment. And the treatment is invariably a drug or, some, or surgical procedure. That is not medicine. That's a clue. That's not medicine. Ultimately, medicine has to be preventative. The goal is not to fix you when you're sick. The goal is to keep you healthy. And the problem is doctors don't know a damn thing about nutrition. I know, because I majored in nutritional biochemistry in college and then went to medical school where they beat it out of me. And every time I bring up something about nutrition, I would basically get my head handed to me like, shut up, Lustig. And so I saw it happen. I saw what went on. I was part of that. And I recognized the problem. The point was I was prepared for what was to come because I'd had that experience in college, because I majored in nutrition, because I'd done research.
One of the things you said, processed food feeds mutated cells and cancer growth.
Indeed. So insulin drives cancer cell proliferation. Insulin is a primary driver of cancer cell proliferation, especially breast cancer and prostate cancer. In addition, fructose, that sweet molecule of sugar that we keep talking about, the only tissue in your body that can metabolize fructose for energy is your liver. That's why the entire fructose load goes to your liver. And then when your liver is overwhelmed, it turns into fat. Okay. Now, turns out there are a few cancers that have a special enzyme. Don't ask me why they have them, but they have them. And this enzyme is called transketolase. Pancreatic cancer is the famous one. And transketolase can turn fructose back into glucose. So if you're consuming fructose, basically you are providing the cancer cell with its own special dietary, energy resource that only the cancer can use. You are feeding the cancer. And what do we give cancer patients to try to keep their weight up? Ensure Plus. And what is Ensure Plus? It is a milkshake and very high in fructose. So we are trying desperately to get, the nutrition companies to get on board with actually, doing the right thing by cancer patients.
I used to volunteer before the pandemic. I volunteered at a cancer hospital doing pet therapy with my dog. As the patients were getting their infusions, which took all day, they would bring them a cart for lunch. Can you guess what they were served?
Oh, donuts.
Well, maybe not quite as bad. They were served sandwiches, on white bread. And then they had their choice, of course, they could have barbecue potato chips, Doritos, or Fritos. And of course,
or all three.
Yeah, exactly. Any flavored soda, and of course, a cookie for dessert. Because their doctor said that nutrition has nothing to do with it.
Nutrition has everything to do with it. And this is part of the problem. Doctors don't know anything about nutrition, especially cancer doctors.
Absolutely. Do you think there's a place for sugar in our diets or treats?
Yeah, when it was a condiment, it was fine. It became a diet staple. And the reason it became a diet staple was because it got cheap. And the reason it got cheap was the Farm Bill. And the reason it got cheap was high fructose corn syrup.
Yeah, but where do you stand on the abstinence moderation continuum? Because for me, I can't have any. I was a sugar addict and obese for all the years until I stopped it, as sugar and caffeine, and I can't have a little, not a drop, not a morsel, not a crumb.
So I hear this from, sugar addicts all the time. People say, how can there be sugar addiction? How many people say, oh, I have a horrible sweet tooth? That's sugar addiction until proven otherwise.
I love that.
That's what it is. Now, there are people who can moderate. There are other people who can't. In the same way, there are people who can moderate their alcohol, and there are other people who can't. Alcoholics Anonymous basically tells alcoholics they can't moderate, that they have to completely abstain. In fact, when they do their introduction, they basically have to say how long they've been sober, how long they haven't touched a drop of alcohol. All right. And nobody wants to go back and say, I've been sober for one day, and they might have been sober for 40 years before that. So, that's the peer pressure thing. Can a sugar addict have an appropriate amount of sugar? And the answer is only if the food industry fixes the food in the first place.
Wow. Well, I've been sugar sober for 6,689 days, but who's counting, right?
That's pretty darn good.
Thanks. You talk about foodable versus druggable. You are, by the way, if this doctor thing doesn't work out, you're really great at writing clever sayings and phrases.
That's very kind of you.
Yeah.
We try. Yeah. I mean, look, ultimately it's a book for the general public. You got to do something to make it, light and readable and, and memorable. So I do my best.
Yeah, that was good. So are you familiar with the work of a Dr. Walter Kempner?
Yes. It's been quite a while, but yes.
So I mean,
long time ago.
Do you believe that there's really just one road to health? Because I find it fascinating that he was able to reverse diabetes with what we would consider basically a sugar diet.
Right. I don't think there's one way. As I said earlier, I think there are a lot of ways to skin this cat.
Yeah.
Okay.
One way to peel the grape, more than one way to peel the grape. I'm just teasing.
Ultimately, in terms of chronic disease, you have to keep the insulin down. Get the insulin down any way you can. Now, a ketogenic diet will get the insulin down. That's why I'm for a ketogenic diet. A high fiber diet will get the insulin down. That's why I'm for a high fiber diet. Now, could a ketogenic diet be the same as a high fiber diet? It could be, although in general, no. Okay. Point is, you are vegan. You would have a very hard time staying on a ketogenic diet. Is there such a thing as a vegan ketogenic diet? Yes, but it'd be hard. There'd be very few options for you. Point is, you can be on a high fiber diet. And a high fiber diet will keep your insulin, your blood glucose and your insulin, virtually identical to that of the low carb diet, virtually identical to that of the ketogenic diet. And that's the point. There are a lot of ways to get there, but ultimately you got to get insulin down. And if you don't get insulin down, then it really doesn't matter what else you do.
Do you think that the way people eat has anything to do with the pandemic? I mean, not causing it, but the outcomes that people are having.
Oh, absolutely. Kraft couldn't keep up with the macaroni and cheese. I mean, they couldn't put enough on the shelves. And, ultimately, people thought, well, I'm going to die anyway of this, pandemic. I might as well enjoy the food I'm eating. And so, what was missing from the store, during the pandemic? The pasta, the candy, not all the healthy food was still there. It was all the ultra processed food that disappeared. In part because people didn't want to have to go to the store because they didn't want to have to get out, which meant that they needed stuff that was storable. And processed food is storable food. So, and people, that we always talked about the freshman 15, now we talk about the COVID 50.
Did you ever struggle yourself, if that's not too personal of a question?
In terms of what?
Like with sugar?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. Yeah, I still do.
Yeah.
Yeah, no. I was a stress eater, without question. My mother was a stress eater. I was a stress eater. Medical school didn't do me any favors. I had to be the master of the 3-second lunch, eating a sandwich, from walking from one clinic to the next because there was no time, built in for lunch. So, I know, I live it too.
You get it so that it's mandatory for nutrition to be taught in medical schools.
Well, that would be nice, but only 28% of medical schools actually have a nutrition curriculum. And those that do only have 19.6 contact hours on average. When you think about the fact that most medical schools have 6,000 contact hours, all right, 19.6 is a drop in the bucket. And guess what? All right, diet-related disease is 75% of all medicine. So don't you think they ought to spend a little more time on it?
Yeah, and what I'm told, it's not even on the boards. When nutrition is taught, it's not even required that they remember it.
That's right. So, why would you be surprised that your doctor doesn't know anything about nutrition? which is why I wrote the book.
You mentioned the Flexner report in your book.
I did. So Abraham Flexner famously published the Flexner report in 1910. That basically said that we doctors needed to practice evidence-based medicine. And evidence-based medicine at the time meant randomized controlled trials, and you can do that easily with drugs. It's really hard to do with food. And vitamins hadn't even been discovered yet, so there was nothing about food that was special as far as Flexner was concerned. And so basically nutrition wasn't even on the menu. And unfortunately, medicine's never, updated that.
Talk about on the menu. I'm sure at some point you worked in a hospital. Look at the menu of what they feed the patients and what in the cafeteria. I mean, they're just perpetuating it. They and they tell me when I've asked them, excuse me, but they say, well, because they give the patients satisfaction surveys, and if we don't give the patients what they want, it will negatively affect our hospital ratings.
Totally. I mean, this is like what's going on in politics today. The base, you got to pander to the base, as it were. That's exactly right. We at UCSF understand this. We actually instituted in 2015 what we call the Healthy Beverage Initiative. So we have a soda ban at UCSF. You cannot buy a sugared soda on our campus. Anyway,
nice. That kind of sounds like
any vendor who brings food onto campus cannot bring sodas.
It sounds like the work of Dr. Michael Rosen at the Cleveland Clinic.
Right. So we were able to do that. And now many hospitals around the country recognize that, hey, where were cigarettes first banned? Hospitals. We're supposed to role model correct behavior for the public. So like if you've got a McDonald's in your hospital lobby, like what are you telling your patients?
And it's always in Children's Hospital. I went to the University of Pennsylvania. There was a McDonald's in the lobby, and the same thing for the Children's Hospital in Los Angeles. I
know that hospital. I know that McDonald's because that's where I had lunch when I interviewed for internship. It was the first hospital to have a McDonald's in the lobby, and they were very proud of it at the time. Guess what? They're not so proud of it now.
Yeah, they shouldn't be. They should feel ashamed. You said, how does going to a doctor make you sick? You mentioned that in your book. I really like that.
Well, so what I said was HMOs make you sick. Jay Bhattacharya, who's at Stanford, basically did an analysis showing the more times you get to go see the doctor, the sicker you get. You'd think it'd be the other way around. The more times you go to the doctor, it's because the sicker you are. No, it's the other way around. So ultimately, because doctors do not understand this concept of chronic disease, they understand statins that treats high LDL. They understand oral hypoglycemics that treats high blood glucose. They understand antihypertensives that treats high blood pressure. They understand those medicines. They don't understand what causes any of it. So it's like giving an aspirin to a patient with a brain tumor because they have a headache. Might help the headache. It's not going to do a damn thing for the brain tumor. We are papering over these chronic diseases because we have a medicine at our disposal that can mollify the symptom rather than actually treating the disease. And so by going to a doctor, you get a false sense of security that you're actually doing something. And the doctor gets a false sense of security that the patient's actually doing something. But in fact, all you're doing is fixing a lab test.
Dr. Lustig, I know you have a hard stop, so I just want to thank you so much for your work and end with one of my favorite quotes from your book, which is, the answer is safe, simple, cheap, and green. It's called real food. And I think on that, we can all agree.
I think so. That is the watchword, and unfortunately, not enough people have embraced it. We need to get shouted from the mountaintops.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Lustig.
All right.